welcome to AT&T ThreatTraq for June 11, 2013. This program provides network security highlights, discussion, and countermeasures for cyber threats. I'm joined today by Jim Clausing and Matt Kaiser, and I'm John Hogoboom. So we have a couple of really interesting stories for you this week. First one out of the gate is one that you were looking at, Jim, about Blackhole exploit kit.
Yeah, this one actually was a blog post done by a friend of mine, Sherry Davidoff, is co-author of a book on network forensics, which is a field of trying to track the bad guys based just on network traffic. And she had an interesting blog post about a week ago. And I thought our viewers might be interested in it too, because she does a couple of videos. We talk often on the show about Blackhole exploit kits and various other exploit kits, and how folks get infected after being phished and that kind of thing. But Sherry does a great job in here of actually showing what happens, which if you don't do this every day, you may not really appreciate what it looks like to the user, or what doesn't necessarily see. So it was an interesting post. She had actually discovered a couple of her customers had told her they had seen some signs of infection. So she went into a lab and infected herself. She clicked on the link from one of these phishing emails that one of her customers had accidentally clicked, and she recorded the whole thing. So, but it was kind of interesting, if you watch these and look at how they try to make their fake site look like the real thing, and how they try to steal information. Great quote in here. Her favorite part was when the attackers tried to steal her debit card number, expiration date, security code, social security number, date of birth, driver's license number, and mother's maiden name all at the same time. With that kind of information, you can steal anybody's identity if you have all of that. But I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail because we've talked about these various exploit kits and how they work before, but just thought there was some really good stuff here, and if you get a chance to take a look at the videos, I found them really interesting. So.
Yeah, I was going to say I'd taken a look at the site also, and it's true. A picture or a video says 1,000 words. It really kind of illustrates how these malware, various malware, and this looked like some banking Trojan type malware. It would inject certain fields onto the web form, even though you're visiting the legitimate website. It's doing like a man-in-the-browser attack where it injects the form fields for the mother's maiden name and all these extra things. So it's kind of interesting to look at. Here's what it looks like when you go there and you're not infected, and here's what it looks like when you are infected, going to the same place with all these extra fields that the malware injects in there. So yeah, it's a very good illustration of that, how that works.
Yeah, and if you're not really all that careful and not aware of what it looks like normally, it's easy to miss those. And as she said in the article, it's not that the site is infected. It's because there's malware running on your system that can inject these, the form elements into the page as it's being displayed to the user. So the site is not asking for all of that stuff. It's the malware on your PC that was asking for it.
Right.
And I enjoyed the portion where they talk about someone getting a phone call from someone pretending to be with the bank and asking that person for the last little bits of information to get into the account. So it's a whole end-to-end thing from an exploit kit to the malware itself, and then there's a human element as well to get into the bank account at the end.
Yep.
She does a really good job of showing all of this, and I thought it would be useful for our viewers and listeners. They might get something out of it, too, so I thought I'd bring it to everybody's attention.
And one of the things I noticed, just as a final remark maybe, is I think someone put in the comments about, I don't understand, how can you get infected just by visiting a web page? And I smack myself on the head going, people still don't get this yet after all of our discussion about Blackhole exploit kit and what that is. You know, that's a drive-by type infection kit that when you just visit the web page, it's going to try all these different attack vectors against your browser and other plugins that might be available to it in order to drop a payload onto your machine. And I think there are obviously some people out there that still don't understand that just visiting a web page, a malicious one, could potentially infect your machine if you don't have, you know, if it's using a zero-day exploit or if you don't have up-to-date patches for all the various things like your browser and Java and Flash and any other types of plugins that, you know, you might be able to use within a browser. Anyhow. Next story is another one that you were covering, Jim, the FIS breach. It was a little bit worse than originally reported?
Yeah. Brian Krebs reported on this one last week. The FDIC released a report that the 2011 breach of FIS was apparently worse than had been originally reported. And yeah, there's a lot of detail in there, but some of the interesting points are, you know, some of the things that went wrong in the course of attempting to contain and recover from it. And it just goes to show that that it isn't necessarily an easy thing to handle. You know, when you've been breached, to handle the incident, to you know, do the proper investigation to figure out how deeply you've been penetrated and how to recover from it. One of the quotes from the report was that, you know, many of the systems were reconstituted and introduced back into the production environment before data preservation techniques were applied. You know, forensic preservation techniques led to servers being re-imaged before analysis was complete, and significant logging data was inadvertently destroyed. Several key servers were reintroduced and subsequently re-compromised because they hadn't figured out how they got in the first place, and so they put them back up there still vulnerable. And it's, you know, these are things that you run across all the time. It's not that these were necessarily bad people, you know, doing stupid things. It's that in the rush to, you know, keep the company online and so forth, you know, sometimes people work a little too quickly, and sometimes the best thing you can do is take a deep breath, step back, and slow down. And so that was one of the key things out of the FDIC audit that came out of this. But a couple of other things that caught my attention were that basically what the folks did when they compromised these is they cloned some ATM cards and then at various places took out a whole bunch of cash. And I was reading this one shortly after we had the report weeks ago about big heist with cloned ATM cards that, you know, were done simultaneously, and it just struck me how similar this attack sounded to the one that we just had a couple of weeks ago, and to other ones that have, you know, taken place over the years, where the bad guys managed to net tens of millions of dollars intrusions, and then managing to clone large number of ATM cards, debit cards, whatever, and take a lot of money out of a lot of people's accounts.
Yeah, and you really got to, I shouldn't say you have to, but these guys really need to be organized when they're trying to pull off a caper of that magnitude with that amount of money being exchanged and being able to kind of money mule that money back out of the country or wherever they're located. I think most of these cases, they're not. I think the money generally ends up in a foreign country. But, these cases are a larger scale schemes than even the kind of Zeus type activity that we've seen. Those will, take money, little bits of money out from lots of different people's accounts, whereas this one's really an organized operation to go try to, steal large amounts of money. They were stealing tens of thousands of dollars from just a single bank card that they increased the minimum threshold on because they had access to the inside of the,
Right, because they had penetrated, in addition to being able to clone these cards, they, increased the limit on daily withdrawals on the cards so that they could take much larger sums of money out at once. Yeah.
And, when you were talking about, we work some forensics investigations ourselves, and it's very understandable. We have large environments with lots of machines, and you find like that first initial breadcrumb of, we have a compromise here. You do need to kind of do your due diligence, follow all those breadcrumbs out to kind of get the totality of maybe the entire compromise and in order before you take any action. So you kind of understand as much as possible the scope of the breach before taking any action, and that's good advice for anybody out there, especially if you have any kind of compromise. Like you said, take a step back, take a breath, and before trying to just react to the immediate problem, try to see if there's more to the story than you're actually seeing right from the get-go. So.
Right, and understand that the pressure is going to be, get things cleaned and back online as quick as possible, and you absolutely want to do that for all businesses that have a web presence where they're doing any kind of e-commerce. That's costing them money if you take systems offline. So the pressure is going to be there, but you need to make sure that you do take the deep breath, take a look at the big picture, and make sure that you're not shooting yourself in the foot by rushing to put something back online before you really know what you're doing.
All right. Thanks for that story. So the next one, we're going to go over to Matt, and Microsoft had another takedown operation, it sounds like, recently.
So Microsoft is calling this Operation B54, and it was targeted against the Citadel variant of the Zeus banking Trojan. And what they're claiming is that they took down 1,462 Citadel botnets. And I do mean botnets and not just individual bots. So that's actually quite a huge number of bots individually. Now what they did is they took down the command and control structures for these botnets and not the individual bots. So what you'll have is a large number of machines that are still infected, but they'll have no one to talk to, which is a pretty good method of taking it down. Not complete. I mean, you still have infected machines. So this is apparently their 7th botnet takedown, and they claim that they worked with law enforcement agencies in a number of countries, including the U.S., Australia, Brazil, Ecuador, Germany, Holland, Hong Kong, Iceland, and the list goes on. And about 455 of those botnets were hosted in the United States, which probably made it a lot easier for them to actually get the permission to do this, to enter data centers. They apparently entered these centers escorted by federal marshals and took down a bunch of these servers. And they have since pointed a bunch of the domains to a number of sinkhole IPs so that I believe they can research and see who is still infected with the malware. So all in all, a pretty impressive takedown by Microsoft.
Yeah, my understanding was that they were actually, they had redirected the domain names to their sinkhole IPs and that they were sending out some sort of a command to either clean up the bot or get rid of some of the secondary command and control. It's been a while since I looked at the article, but as I recall, they were actually, any infected machines that were still out there were going to be contacting these Microsoft servers, and so that so that the bad guys couldn't later regain control with some alternate command and control. They were modifying configuration in some way.
And if that's the case, that's a great move as well.
Yeah, so, Microsoft, this is the first one of their operations here, and I agree. I think this is a good move. I hope that in the future here we'll get some more information. Hopefully, my hope out of these kinds of operations is not only do they kind of sinkhole those bots so that they can't talk to the command and control and get their login and credentials stolen anymore, but more importantly, I'd like to see that the actors behind the botnet actually get criminally prosecuted. Now, of course, that's going to be a law enforcement type effort, but hopefully they can get that, and especially with these international things going on, it's not always that easy to do. It's not trivial to go figure out who it is behind these, these criminal botnets and prosecute them. But, unless that happens at some point, they could just pop up again with some new domains and some new malware, just rebuild it and continue along. But hopefully someday they'll get these guys. And in the past, I know that there have been prosecutions against some of these larger botnet operators once they've done some takedown efforts. So that would be my hope here with this one as well.
I hear what you're saying. And since Citadel is a crimeware kit, it's relatively easy for people to set it up on their own. And the number of botnets they took down is a testament to just how easy it is for someone to actually create a Citadel botnet.
All right. So you've got one more story, Matt. Something about the Gamarue botnet and using a new way to host its malware.
It's a new way, but it's sort of an old way as well. So it turns out there are new variants of the Gamarue malware that Trend Micro has discovered in the wild that are using SourceForge. And if you're not familiar with SourceForge, it's a very popular open source code repository and project hosting platform to host their malware. So SourceForge apparently has over 300,000 different projects that are hosted there where people can, upload code, develop it, collaborate, and those sort of things, and then distribute it as well. It's a great place to go for neat software projects. I've used it myself. It seems that Gamarue is getting in on the action by using it to store encrypted binaries. So the malware itself, malware operators will upload Gamarue in an encrypted form to this service, which provides file hosting, and then during the infection process, pull down the binary and or pull down some updates. Like I said, this is sort of a new and old sort of story because if you're hosting any sort of service on the Internet that allows users to sign up for free and use you as a storage provider or a communications host, there's going to be some sort of abuse. Unfortunately, it puts anybody who's hosting a service like this in the position of being not only the provider, but also the police of their own content. I don't hold it against SourceForge at all for not knowing that this was there immediately because the files were encrypted, and most antivirus would have a very hard time detecting the presence of the Gamarue malware. It seems Trend Micro has contacted them, and the accounts that were being used to host this are going to be taken down. But again, it seems to be one of those same old stories where someone on the Internet that's hosting a very popular service is being abused for malicious purposes.
Yeah.
Right. Go ahead, Tim.
We've seen the bad guys, store their stuff in lots of public places. Dropbox is one that's been used quite a bit, and so in that sense, this is the first time I'm aware of them using SourceForge, but it's not really surprising. As you said, any place that allows random folks on the Internet to upload files there and make them available to the rest of the Internet is going to get abused by the bad guys this way.
Yeah, and I think that the fact that it's stored up on SourceForge in an encrypted manner probably, indicates how the attacker knew that if they just put their malware binary up there straight, SourceForge is generally pretty good about that. I mean, they are a source code website. They kind of look at their content, like you said, and police themselves pretty well. So the only way the attacker, and it's somewhat of a desperate maneuver, they had to encrypt it in order to actually be able to keep it up there, because I would imagine that would have gotten removed really quickly if they had not done that. So interesting story. And again, like you said, not a new thing. Probably new in that I haven't seen SourceForge utilized in this way before, but we certainly see lots of these other file sharing, these open file sharing hosting providers get abused in this way regularly. So, all right, thanks for that, guys. And I think we're ready to move on to the Internet Weather Report. And so let's take a look at what we have for this week. I'm going to say that this week is all about the Port 8000 series of ports being scanned. So first one out of the chute here is port 8118 TCP. This is the Privoxy HTTP proxy port, or it's well known as that, and that's very likely what they're looking at here, or they're looking for. It's mostly sources in the United States that we've seen, and in the past day, actually, we saw a decent increase in the number of sources scanning on this. It's not a huge number, but the fact that we had an increase here, it's actually up in the 35 to 36 range. In reality, it's probably some order of magnitude larger than that, but they're all engaged in this scanning activity simultaneously. That's also usually a really good indicator that there's probably a botnet behind this scanning activity, telling a whole bunch of machines at once to go scan. So if you're running Privoxy, especially if it's an open proxy using Privoxy on port 8118, you'd want to take a look and keep an eye out for anybody that might be trying to utilize your open proxy for any types of malicious reasons or otherwise just obfuscate traffic. The next port 8000 one on our list is port 8081 TCP. This one's well known as Sun Proxy Admin port, and I think there's a couple of other. It's used by quite a bunch of different services. 8081 is pretty frequently used by lots of other web-type services as an alternate web port. So they might be looking for just open proxies in general. This is a small number of sources in China doing some very specific targeted scanning over periods of time. Normally have a pretty low base floor of noise here. It's very low, but we see upwards of 2 million scans an hour on occasion here. So that's another one to keep an eye out for. And the next port 8000 is 8880 TCP, and we had looked at this last week. So I just kind of wanted to show you, we saw the leading indicator of this one last week, and we talked about it. This is also used by WebSphere, and it's probably, they might be actually looking for WebSphere as opposed to the CD database protocol. I think we talked about that last week. The well-known port for 8880 is the CD database protocol, which is a protocol for indexing and looking up compact disk database information. So if you're familiar with the CDDB service, it's that protocol for looking up track names and artist information and whatnot. I don't think that's probably what they're really looking for here. I think it's probably more proxy-type servers or other types of HTTP-based services running on that port. So this is last week's view. We saw a small number of sources from France and Czechoslovakia increase, and we had just seen it last week on the day of the show when we were recording. If we look at this week's, you notice we're continuing to see large spikes of it. So the previous week, really nothing, so to speak, and then we've had some continued scanning here. Interesting twist or change in the profile is, by a large margin, is mostly sources in the U.S. now, and then still some from Czechoslovakia. I don't see any ones from France anymore, so I don't know what that means, other than, we have a little bit of a different mix of the participants in this scanning activity. So if you have anything running on this port, you want to keep an eye out for it, for anybody scanning and trying to utilize it for malicious reasons. And then the last one for the week is, this is port 5800 TCP. And if you're not familiar with this, this is actually registered as VNC. Oh, I should just got a note that Czechoslovakia is been split into two different countries, so it might be one of those two countries now. Our registry data is indicating Czechoslovakia, but I don't have the precise location, so it's somewhere in that part of the world. But I guess there's been some geopolitical shift in how that country is organized. So getting back to this other one, port 5800 TCP, which is well known as VNC over HTTP. If you're not, we talk about VNC a lot on port 5900. We see that a lot in scanning activity. VNC, as everyone probably knows, is virtual network computer. It's remote desktop type protocol software that allows you to share your desktop. So you can run this software on your machine, and then from another machine connect to that machine running the service and remotely control it. So port 5800 TCP, this one's a little less commonly known, but there are variants of VNC that are written, which actually run on port 5800, and they offer, this is an option usually, I don't think it's on by default, but you can turn on a listener on port 5800 that actually serves up a web page to the user. So if they browse to that port 5800 with a web browser, it will give them a page back, which will allow them to log in with VNC, and it kind of pushes a Java-based VNC browser back to the user, and they can interact with the VNC service without actually having the VNC client software on their PC. A little complicated, but it's basically VNC over HTTP via some Java stuff usually. And so this is probably a scanner looking for this type of thing. And the activity just started up today or last night, I believe. It's a single source in Iceland, interesting source. But he was pretty aggressively scanning for this. Don't know how successful it'll be, because as I said, I don't think it's quite as oftenly enabled, but even a few would be a good threat vector for him to start working against and trying to compromise. We don't see this one scan that much, so if there is any there, he might be the only guy who's actually finding them.
And it is, with a couple of the free VNC servers, it is one of the checkboxes that I think is actually checked in at least one of them by default. So you have to explicitly uncheck it to turn it off. So it is on by default with at least some fraction of the VNC servers out there.
Okay, I didn't know that. So that's good to know. Then maybe it is something that a lot of people, especially if they don't know what they're doing, and they set it up and they just take all the defaults, it might be enabled and they don't even know it. So if you do run VNC, as always, we talk about filter it so only certain source IPs can get access to it that should be getting access to it. If you can tunnel it over SSH, it's even better. But check your VNC configurations. Make sure you're not running this listener on 5800 if you're not aware that that's even an option, just to make sure that you're covered there. And for the scanning activity, this is the most probed ports, and this is basically the most probing activity you see. Not the most number of sources doing it, but what ports are probed most often on the internet for the past few days. So no real big changes here. I think we talk about this all the time. So 445 TCP is probably your conflict infections or your other botnets seeking machines that still have the SMB vulnerability there. I forget, I think it's MS-08067, or there might even be some MS-10 one, I can't remember now. But they're looking for, vulnerable machines listening on that port. 1433 TCP is your Microsoft SQL server. That could either be a vulnerability or just brute force attempts trying to get access to that database. And then you've got a lot of your remote access type stuff that we see all the time. 3389 TCP is remote desktop protocol. 23 TCP is telnet. 22 is SSH. All of those are remote access types of capabilities into machines. That's why they're scanned so often, because people want to, get in the easiest way possible. A lot of those types of these remote access ones generally are brute force types attacks, where they're going to password guess themselves with a list of passwords and try to get in. And I think Jim's covered some of the the types of passwords we see frequently. And then you've got your zero-access botnet, the 16464 and 16471 UDP. That's a peer-to-peer protocol that the zero-access botnet uses in order to communicate. And ADTCP, this could be scanning for just web servers in general, looking for web hosts or even proxies sometimes run on port 80. I'm not sure that we see that as often, ADTCP. I should probably take a closer look at that, see if there's anything strange there.
Yeah, it has shown up in the top 10 at least a handful of times this calendar year. So.
Okay.
It could also be scanning for particular web vulnerabilities.
That's very true, too. We do know there's certain actors out there lately that are scanning for web servers in general that might be running certain software on there that is vulnerable to certain exploits. A lot of content management systems have various vulnerabilities, especially the open source content management systems. So that's a good point, Matt. Thanks for bringing that up. And then in terms of the most sources probing, our zero-access ones really show up more dramatically here because there are a lot of sources, a lot of infected hosts out there with zero access. So, again, this is the most sources probing, so we're going to see them kind of pop to the top of the list here. And that's what these 4 ports are, 16, 465, 464, 470, and 471 are all related to zero access. The 445 TCP usually takes the lion's share of the mix there because there is a lot of activity of scanning on that port. There's still a lot of latent configure infections out there. You know, configure's a worm. Every once in a while, we'll see them pop up in various spots on the internet because, you know, maybe somebody has some kind of embedded appliance that runs Microsoft Windows and it's a really old version, and they never, you know, it's not part of their main patching systems and whatnot. So they're sitting out there vulnerable because it's kind of an appliance version of Windows on there, and it was never updated and got infected. That's just one case scenario for that, why it's able to persist as long as it has. And then the 23 TCP telnet, and again, 80 TCP and a remote desktop protocol on 3389 TCP filling out the rest. A lot of this ICMP stuff that we see on both charts, some of it is probably not security relevant. Other parts of it might be backscatter. Other parts of it could be related to scanning. A lot of times scanning tools will actually try to do a ping first just to make sure that the host is alive before it tries all the other ports that might scan on it. So there's some of that type of possibility on why we see more of that up in these charts here. And so that's our weather report. And I guess for the last thing is top concerns. I think, Jim, you might have had a top concern you wanted to talk about or to round out the show here.
Yeah, I'm not sure if it qualifies as a concern, but I have talked in the last couple of weeks about, you know, IPv6 and the amount of IPv6 traffic, and I came across an article on the Enterprise Networking Planet blog. IPv6 launch day was just over a year ago, and so this was a look at how much IPv6 traffic we're seeing a year later. And you know, as we talked about a couple of times in the last couple of weeks, the total amount of IPv6 traffic is still relatively small in most of the world compared to IPv4 traffic. But we are seeing steady increases in it. One of the things that this article noted was that only 12% of the Alexa top 1,000 websites are accessible via IPv6. But most of the big ones made a big deal last year of turning up IPv6 on IPv6 launch day. But Cisco is saying that by the end of the year, they expect 3.1% of the total IP traffic to be IPv6, up from 1.3% at the end of 2012. So that's, you know, more than doubled this year. and continuing to see the growth of it. We've seen Deutsche Telekom went from having virtually no measurable IPv6 traffic to being in the top 10 in the world in a year. So it's coming, and if we're not, as I've said probably a dozen times on this show, if you're not ready for it, you're going to get overwhelmed by it. We need to be paying attention to it.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I could do subnet math forward and backward in my head for IPv4, but in the IPv6 world, I'm not quite ready yet. So, we have a lot of our stuff in place and already active to handle for the reporting and logging and that type of stuff with IPv6. But in terms of me from an analysis perspective and thinking about all the types of things and the new vulnerabilities that might introduce and other types of network-related things I need to consider with IPv6, I haven't really got all of that in line in my head yet. So you're right. That maybe not a concern, but make sure you're thinking about it or getting your mind wrapped around that so that you're ready for when the world does really shift to IPv6 and we're seeing more traffic on it.
Yep. So there's no doubt in my mind I'll be mentioning IPv6 again in future shows. Just keep it in front of all of us, because like you, I've been doing IPv4 for so long that I've got that, down in my head, as you said, and I don't have, even though I've been thinking about it a lot for the last couple of years, it's still not as automatic for me as IPv4, so. And I'm sure that it's that way for a lot of our viewers and listeners, too.
Right. Hopefully, once it becomes more widespread and we're all using it more, it's always one of those things. The more you actually use it and work in it, the more automatic that type of stuff becomes. I'm pretty sure I'm still not going to remember IPv6 IP addresses very well. My brain's getting old. I can do v4 pretty well, but a long IPv6 I'm not going to remember. So, but there might not be any sense in doing that anyway. So in any event, interesting. Thanks for bringing that one to us. So that's our show for today. If you'd like to get in touch with us, as always, you can email us at ThreatTraq@list.att.com. You can also find us on Twitter at ThreatTraq. And the ThreatTraq video is available at att.com/ThreatTraq and on YouTube as well. Just search for the keyword ThreatTraq. You could also subscribe to an audio-only version on iTunes, so you can listen to it in your car on the way to work or on the way home. Thanks for joining us today. Thank you, Jim and Matt. And we'll be back next week with a new episode. Until then, keep your network safe.